When an incredibly highly talented, deeply innocent young teenage girl slowly walked onto the completely massive, brightly lit global television stage for the highly intimidating callback rounds, the entire massive worldwide audience completely entirely expected a highly standard traditional vocal performance. But the very second she completely actively entirely started striking the heavy metal strings of her electric guitar, something completely incredibly massive, highly unexpected happened that completely entirely deeply shocked the entire famous celebrity judging panel completely, entirely, absolutely perfectly. Today, we are completely actively heavily analyzing how an incredibly brutal classic rock masterpiece completely successfully transformed a heavily nervous audition into an absolutely massive television triumph perfectly successfully. The heartbreaking parental doubt. To completely, entirely successfully deeply understand the incredibly massive, highly emotional weight of this beautiful television performance completely perfectly safely, we must actively retrace the completely deeply heartbreaking human origins of her incredible musical journey entirely successfully. Before she entirely completely actively stood heavily on the massive brightly lit global television stage completely successfully, her completely deeply loving but incredibly highly worried parents entirely strongly advised her to completely abandon her beautiful deep musical dreams entirely perfectly. They completely deeply actively heavily believed that the incredibly massive highly competitive global music entertainment industry was completely entirely way too incredibly difficult, and entirely strongly suggested she entirely safely strictly pursue a completely standard traditional business career entirely safely, perfectly. This incredibly massive heavy parental doubt completely entirely successfully built an absolutely incredibly deep heavy emotional fire completely directly entirely inside her beautiful young highly passionate human artistic soul entirely successfully perfectly, forever directly actively strongly pushing her to completely entirely successfully completely prove her absolutely undeniable massive global human talent to the completely entire massive global world completely perfectly safely. The secret backstage mentorship. While she was completely entirely actively waiting deeply nervously behind the massive high bright television stage completely successfully entirely perfectly, an incredibly massive deeply important completely highly crucial human conversation entirely actively completely successfully happened entirely safely perfectly. She was completely entirely actively heavily instructed that possessing absolutely incredibly massive highly pure musical talent was completely entirely simply not completely totally enough to successfully survive the completely entirely brutal massive television competition completely perfectly safely. She completely actively deeply entirely successfully learned that absolute complete total true showmanship and completely entirely successfully creating incredibly massive highly deeply completely unforgettable human moments were entirely completely strictly completely necessary to make the massive live global television audience completely actively heavily entirely completely scream wildly entirely perfectly safely. She completely entirely heavily absorbed this incredibly massive deeply heavy professional television advice completely actively successfully perfectly, incorporating every single massive deep critical lesson entirely directly completely into her completely massive highly entirely brilliant upcoming human artistic television execution entirely smoothly perfectly. The intimidating television stage.
When the completely, entirely, incredibly massive, highly, totally beautiful young teenage artist finally completely actively slowly stepped entirely heavily out completely directly onto the absolute massive globally broadcast television stage entirely perfectly completely safely, the incredibly massive heavy psychological television pressure was entirely completely absolutely undeniably massive, entirely actively deeply completely heavily entirely felt perfectly safely. She entirely completely successfully heavily admitted that she felt completely entirely deeply highly nervous entirely perfectly completely successfully facing the incredibly massive highly elite deeply critical celebrity television judging panel completely directly entirely strictly perfectly safely. However, she completely entirely deeply actively heavily entirely successfully carried an absolutely completely entirely incredibly massive deeply profound human dream inside her incredibly highly passionate completely beautiful young human artist heart entirely perfectly successfully deeply completely. She completely entirely actively successfully heavily remembered that completely entirely directly standing exactly right there completely safely was entirely absolutely her completely incredibly massive lifelong deep human television goal completely perfectly. The shocking rock masterpiece. The entire completely massive, deeply heavy global television audience and the entirely completely highly famous, deeply critical elite celebrity television judging panel completely entirely actively expected a completely entirely deeply highly standard safe vocal performance entirely safely perfectly completely successfully entirely. But she completely, entirely, successfully, actively, heavily, completely shocked the absolute entire massive global internet world when the completely, incredibly heavy, massive, intense, classic alternative rock music totally, entirely, completely began playing loudly, entirely, safely, perfectly, completely, directly. Choosing to completely, entirely, actively, successfully, completely, perfectly perform the incredibly massive, highly legendary, deeply complex alternative rock anthem Hysteria, originally created by the absolute massive legendary global music band Muse, was an incredibly massive, highly dangerous, completely, totally deep artistic television risk, entirely, completely, perfectly, successfully, safely. This incredibly massive, totally deep, heavy musical choice completely, entirely, actively, perfectly proved her absolute, complete, total, highly pure, massive artistic human bravery, entirely, completely, perfectly, smoothly, entirely, forever, entirely, actively, safely. The flawless instrumental execution. Absolutely, completely, entirely, immediately upon completely, entirely, actively, successfully striking the incredibly massive, highly heavy metal guitar strings, completely, perfectly, smoothly, entirely, safely, she completely, entirely, actively, successfully, completely, heavily unleashed an absolutely incredibly massive, highly powerful, totally pure, deep electric rock explosion, entirely, completely, perfectly, successfully, safely. The absolute, complete, total, pure human technical difficulties strictly required to completely, entirely, successfully, actively sing an incredibly massive, highly, completely, deeply powerful, heavy rock vocal, totally, entirely, smoothly, perfectly, while completely, actively, entirely, simultaneously executing incredibly massive, highly complex, heavy electric guitar, completely, totally beautiful solos, is completely, entirely, absolutely mind-blowing, entirely, perfectly, completely, successfully, safely. She completely, entirely, actively, heavily, entirely, perfectly, successfully mastered incredibly massive, highly demanding, deep instrumental techniques, completely, directly, exactly in front of completely, entirely millions of highly amazed global television viewers, entirely, completely, perfectly, safely, completely, beautifully, entirely.
The massive confidence explosion. The absolute, completely, entirely massive, highly, totally beautiful, incredible, completely, entirely successful, deep transformation from an incredibly, highly, deeply quiet, entirely, completely shy teenage girl, entirely, completely, perfectly, safely, completely, entirely, actively, heavily, smoothly transitioned, completely, deeply, totally, beautifully, entirely, successfully, directly, exactly into an absolute, completely, totally, entirely massive, highly, completely, purely confident electric rock star, completely, entirely, perfectly, safely. She completely, entirely, actively, successfully, completely, heavily, totally utilized entirely, completely every single absolute massive, highly physical, completely, entirely beautiful inch of that incredibly massive, highly elite global television stage, entirely, perfectly, securely, completely, actively. She completely, entirely, successfully, actively, heavily, completely commanded the absolute, complete, total, entire, massive global television audience, entirely, deeply, perfectly, completely, successfully, forcing them to completely, entirely, heavily, completely, safely, completely, actively, wildly scream completely loudly, entirely, beautifully, perfectly, safely, forever, entirely, deeply, perfectly. The celebrity judges' reaction. The incredibly massive, highly famous, deeply critical, elite celebrity television judging panel was completely, entirely, actively, heavily, deeply, completely, successfully, absolutely, genuinely, entirely, completely, totally, completely amazed by the incredibly massive, highly perfect physical execution, completely, heavily, continuously happening, entirely, directly, completely, strictly, actively, perfectly, right in front of them, completely, safely, perfectly, entirely. They completely, entirely, successfully, actively, completely, directly, completely, heavily noticed that she completely, entirely, totally, completely, absolutely, completely, actively possessed an incredibly massive, highly deep, perfectly, totally, completely, purely, completely, entirely, beautifully confident stage, entirely, successfully, perfectly, entirely. The completely massive, highly, completely amazing, totally, entirely, deep, heavy, completely, purely, absolute, deep, completely raw, completely, totally, powerful, heavy metal rock energy, completely, entirely, successfully, totally, entirely, heavily, purely, perfectly, completely infected the incredibly massive, highly, deeply, completely elite television judges, completely, perfectly. The bold television interaction. When the incredibly massive, highly beautiful, entirely amazing, complete, deep, heavy, completely, perfectly, successfully, entirely, deep, heavy, completely, entirely, highly, entirely, completely, purely musical television performance completely, entirely, successfully, entirely, completely, safely concluded, completely, entirely, perfectly, successfully, directly.
She completely, entirely, actively, successfully, entirely, completely, heavily, entirely, boldly addressed the incredibly massive, highly elite, deeply, completely famous celebrity television judges, completely, entirely, actively, entirely, directly, entirely, smoothly, perfectly, completely, entirely, absolutely, entirely, safely, completely. She completely, entirely, deeply, successfully, actively, heavily, entirely, proudly, completely, deeply, confidently stated that she completely, entirely, strongly, totally, completely, heavily, deeply, entirely, genuinely felt that she completely, entirely, actively, successfully, entirely, completely, perfectly, entirely, successfully, completely played absolutely perfectly, entirely, completely, perfectly, successfully. This incredibly massive, highly bold, completely, deeply, truly confident human television interaction, completely, entirely, successfully, completely, totally, entirely, actively, perfectly, thoroughly, completely charmed everyone, entirely, completely, perfectly, safely, forever. The ultimate ticket promise.
The completely, entirely massive, highly entertaining, deeply famous celebrity television judge, completely, entirely, successfully, actively, entirely, heavily, delivered an incredibly massive, entirely complete, total, absolute, undeniable, highly perfect factual evaluation, completely, entirely, strictly, directly to the incredibly talented young artist, completely, entirely, successfully, absolutely, deeply, safely, perfectly, entirely. He completely, entirely, actively, heavily, officially, directly, entirely, completely, totally, directly, enthusiastically stated that her incredibly massive, deeply flawless, beautiful musical routine was entirely, absolutely, completely, highly, purely, completely, entirely, totally, highly, successfully, entirely, completely, absolutely, thoroughly, entirely, completely, deeply, successfully, amazing, completely, entirely, perfectly, safely. He completely, entirely, successfully, officially, formally declared that completely, entirely, regardless of the absolutely complete, massive, formal television competition, completely, entirely, official, entirely, total, active, absolutely, completely final results. He completely, entirely, truly, successfully, highly, deeply, actively, strictly, fully, purely, safely, purely, entirely, completely intends to absolutely, completely, entirely purchase massive live concert tickets to completely watch her completely, deeply, perfectly, forever. The final parental redemption. This incredibly massive, highly, totally, complete, absolute, completely, entirely successful, deep global television triumph, completely, entirely, actively, successfully, heavily, totally, perfectly, entirely, deeply, completely, successfully, absolutely, heavily, directly, entirely, safely, completely, beautifully, completely brought her incredibly massive, completely, highly emotional, deep story, entirely, completely, totally, completely, perfectly, entirely, full circle, completely, perfectly, entirely, safely, successfully. Those incredibly massive, highly, completely, deeply loving, but incredibly highly worried parents who entirely strongly advised her to completely abandon her beautiful, deep musical dreams entirely perfectly, are now completely, entirely, successfully, deeply, absolutely, totally, incredibly, highly, immensely, incredibly, entirely, fully, completely, actively, completely proud of her incredibly massive, absolute, complete, total human success, completely, entirely, perfectly, completely, safely, completely, entirely, successfully. She completely, entirely, actively, completely, perfectly proved that completely, entirely true, deeply, genuine, highly, completely pure human musical talent, completely, entirely, absolutely, perfectly, completely, successfully, actively, completely, safely, conquers all entirely, completely, perfectly.